Triumph and Tragedy. This is a new one, and I have to say, for the first, I don't know, portion of the game, I'm trying to think of how far, up until 39 or so, when the war started, I was thinking, wow, this is the coolest game that I've seen in a long, long time. I'm having the kind of reaction to this that I had, to the couple of really awesome new games that brought me back into gaming at all. Things like Imperial and Twilight Struggle. Here I Stand. That just really, I was like, oh, these are so awesome. Gaming's changed in so many ways. Well, this was giving me that same kind of feeling. Like, this is just such an awesome game. In a way that, the Hot Coin series doesn't quite do for me. I'm not sure why. Maybe if I had seen that instead of Imperial, I would have been just as excited. And maybe the reason that I'm so excited about this is having just gotten through, a series of fairly big, longer games driving my attention. But this really, really had a very cool gameplay mechanic or mechanism going on at the early stage of the game. Then I started playing with the military side of things. And design-wise, I'm not too terribly upset about, the playing the cards to activate units. That all seemed to work well enough. But when it came down to physically moving the units around and knocking blocks around, having a buckets of dice type system, that started with reducing my enjoyment overall. And it didn't hurt that there were larger dice that helped knock the blocks around. Sure, some people have dice towers or roll in the box or whatever, and I probably should have, but those things kind of got in the way. The only problem I had early on in the game, and other than screwing up a couple of rolls, which is no big shock given that it's me, was keeping the tracks aligned correctly. There's a lot of counting involved in that. What's really exciting here in this game, at least in that early stage, is you have this handful of cards. Well, first of all, you have this production value, and you can build up your military, which you're going to need at some point or another, unless, at the very least, you got to keep building it to keep other people from saying, I'm going to beat you up. So you have to devote some of your points towards the military, but the other points are devoted towards buying cards. And the cards have different values to them, both of which are really useful towards building up your position in terms of both victory points and in terms of your capabilities later in the game to be able to handle things in terms of, well, for victory points, because production is your victory points for the most part. So if everything is just left alone, it comes down to production. And there you still have choices. So you have two types of decks you can buy from. The first type gives you the ability to increase your factories, or maybe some espionage activity, largely related to technologies, and also to create technologies. Creating technologies is something that I did a fair amount of, and I'm kind of questioning just how valuable those technologies are. One of them, at least, is worth victory points, which is developing towards the atomic bomb. That is one of 3 ways you have of winning the game, and that's another cool thing. Well, maybe 4 if you want to count just running the clock out and having the most victory points. But basically, you have 3 things that you can target for to end the game early. One is to reach a large number of victory points, and I think the West was in a position in the game that I was playing, because the other 2 players were fighting it out, to be able to sit back and say, okay, well, as long as that's the case, I'm just going to score victory points. And that was working pretty well. The second is to get the atomic bomb. And I think that's kind of a Hail Mary, to tell you the truth. The Germans started off, they had the 2 first levels to the atomic bomb. That's worth a couple of victory points. So they scored that as a secret technology, which meant that they're able to, keep other people from getting it as easily. In fact, it reduces the number of those technology cards that are sitting in the deck and makes it much, much easier to prevent anyone else from following that route. Once you take the first step, somehow you've prevented other people from getting that step. There's a lot in this game that doesn't really comport well with history. And my initial thought was, okay, let's just throw out the historical discussion because I'm having such a good time here and it's such a fun game. But I do want to kind of scratch upon at least trying to consider, is there a fair amount of history going on in here? Is there more than there seems to be when you scratch the surface? And I'm not sure of that answer, so we'll have to kind of rap about that a little bit as we go. But so largely when you buy these, you're buying probably to try to increase your industrialization, because your victory points go off with that. Your ability to buy more cards and more military units goes up with that. When you buy these early in the game, you're buying them probably for more their diplomatic effects. And they have multiple kinds of diplomatic effects, like these, which have maybe 2 technologies, or technology and an espionage or whatever on the front. These guys have 2 countries on them that you can be adding influence to, essentially. Now, these guys have a third use, just like those do, or a second use that isn't divided or whatever, which is as a command card to allow you to move pieces around. And early in the game, you're not going to want many command cards, but you may actually want to do a lot of diplomacy, because some powers, such as the Axis, don't have a lot of population and resources, and they can gain those by making allies with the minor countries. So you've got this really cool dynamic where, you're making this choice of how much of your production to expend on these 2 different development type things and how much on your military itself. That's a choice you're not usually faced with in games. The one exception that I can think of, and the game that probably is the closest to this in some ways, is Hitler's War, which I say the old Avalon Hill Hitler's War. Well, yeah, it was also metagaming before that. Less quality components. But then as you shift into the position where somebody's actually going to go to war, things become very different, because not only are you probably going to have to buy more units and neglect some of your card plays for that, you also have to buy these cards for their command rating. Now, these have become probably less valuable for diplomacy by the midpoint of the game, because a lot of the countries have become fully aligned and no one can move them anymore. However, these cards are absolutely vital to moving your pieces around on the board. You need one for each season that you want to move, and they're allocated to specific seasons. If you don't get the right season, you can still use the cards, but at a much, much lesser value. And you kind of need to play one just about every season, unless you've built this fortified wall or something. And by not playing one in a season once the war is broken out, you're basically saying, I have no mobility at all. I am really vulnerable to whatever you want to do to me, and I can't react to it in any way. So in general, if somebody else is playing a card and you think they're going to attack you, you have to respond to it. All the players have the opportunity to kind of grab minors, not just diplomatically, but they can do it militarily as well. That means the Western Allies can march into the Low Countries if they want to. Generally, that's not a great idea for them. It's really advantageous only to the Axis because the Axis really needs population and resources. Most of the other powers have a fair amount, well, the other two powers have a fair amount of that, of those aspects, and their focus may be more on building up their industry, but they also have to consider alliances for taking power away from the Axis powers and also for possible buffer states and such, or paths to India. Although that didn't work out terribly well. So, for the Axis, on the other hand, actually invading powers makes a little bit more sense, but that comes with a cost. It gives each of the other players 2 diplomatic cards for that, or 2 command cards, as the case is, so that they can actually do more military action. So you kind of give them some free money, as it were, that they don't need, you to be able to see. Your decision to declare war on a major power is also a big deal, because to do so, you take a -1 victory point, and you give them a cheaper industrialization cost, which is a really big deal for certain powers. So, for example, if the Axis can kind of snowball into a powerhouse, and I don't think that's unlikely. It's not like everybody's even at the start or anything. They have the bigger production at the beginning, and they start with a freebie pile, a much larger pile of diplomatic cards at the beginning. If they can kind of snowball their position into a strong one, and there's not a lot of conflict except among the diplomacy at this point, and some little espionage type cards that you can hurt other people with. If they can do that, and that's likely, then they're in a position where maybe they can sit back, and this is what it looked like in my game, and just not declare war. Simply keep growing their own economy because their economy is bigger. And that kind of forces one of either the Soviets or the Western Allies to declare war. Now, in the game I played, the Axis was busy intervening in other, grabbing Sweden, actually, when the Russians decided, looks weak, I'll declare war. That didn't work very well, maybe because I screwed up a rule, but also because the position was not as weak as it looked, and the Soviets ended up really on the ropes against the Germans. I missed one of the victory conditions, perhaps the most important, the military one, which is to grab 2 of your enemy's capitals. The positioning of the capitals is such, and this caused me a real problem here, and kind of made the very end of the game come in a manner that I wasn't expecting it to happen. I was fully prepared for the game to end based on an Allied victory because they overwhelmed the Germans, but there was sort of a maneuvering error. And that's one thing, you can definitely screw up so many things in this game from the very beginning, where you've lost, man. Unless somebody else is able, unless you're able to then use your diplomatic skills to convince somebody else to kind of bail you out a little bit. That seems pretty unlikely, though. You'll probably instead be the carcass sitting on the table of the other 2 players as they try to rush to victory. So, I'm trying to think what I was going to say. I rattled on for a long time. For the military itself, other than the way there's an interplay of how these command cards work, I've seen cards in block games before where you have to, play a card to move a piece or to move a couple of pieces or whatever. And it's similar to that, essentially. The blocks themselves, like I say, they run on a buckets of dice type system, but it's a modified one, kind of like Axis and Allies. Different units fire at different phases in the combat, and they hit different units at different values. It's actually a fairly complex structure for a buckets of dice or whatever type system. It's not pure buckets of dice at all. I did have a real problem though with that end game situation, which was one. The major power within a faction, Germans, Brits, or Russians, can be taken out with their capital, with their one main capital, Berlin or Moscow or London. Now, in the case of Russia or Germany, that means their entire country falls under the control, more or less, of the person who conquered them. And that's a problem, because the Germans and Russians each have a minor capital in them, which means you only have to take one space to win the game, because you only need 2 of these capitals from your rivals to win the game. And that's where the surprise factor was kind of in play there. And it left kind of a bad taste at the end of something that was already declining because of the movement and combat of the blocks. That's just not my taste in terms of war games. And not looking at this even as not a war game, assuming it's not an accurate simulation at any level, and there's a strong indication that it's not, then it I don't know, it kind of feels it was just sort of the insult to the injury of dealing with that kind of block game type situation, was having this end that I was not expecting to happen through an error, basically. Anyway, let me try to think about what else. Well, let's talk about components, because I can't consider too much. So one of the interesting things here is this record sheet, which seems to indicate that you're allowed to write down, what everybody buys. Therefore, it's open. And it also seems to indicate that, well, if you can write that down and you have these other note spaces here, that you can actually write down a lot of stuff. And if you did start tracking this, revealed information or non-hidden information, but is it trackable or not, if you started writing down too much of that, you would know a great deal about what the opponent's disposition is. On the other hand, if you don't have that, you can use memory, and then it becomes a game of memory and who's got the advantage there. I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing, but you do have a fair idea of what your opponent's, force is like. So he's not going to be able to kind of trick you by the size of his forces, unless, of course, he bumps a block or something. So that's one of the first components. The blocks themselves, I don't like these things. In a 3-player game, they're especially kind of annoying, because it's not just 2 people sitting across from each other where you can't see them. You're trying to set it up so that neither of 2 people can see them, and it's possible, but it's much, much easier to cause problems. In addition, you enter into an area, and then your blocks are turned face up, and they stay sitting on the table face up. Becomes kind of tricky to see just how many pips they have. I mean, it's one thing to see how many pips are facing when a block is, standing up straight, and you just know it's this. But when it's face up on the board, or worse, face down on the board in a few cases, it really starts becoming, too easy to screw up a block. a value position. And I have other gripes about blocks, but you can listen to the intro for those. The cards, these are the sturdier, stiffer versions of GMT's cards, not as easy to shuffle. How much more defensible are they in terms of not getting damaged? I don't know, but they're definitely very, very stiff and a little harder to shuffle than one would like. Possible to damage yourself on them even. I don't know why GMT seems to have, they have a number of different types of cards, but they've never gotten them perfect. MMP does a good job on their cards. GMT should try to figure out what cards they use. It's probably a little more expensive, but it might be worth it. The map is obnoxious. It's one of these card stock maps. They seem to be standard fare over in the block game world. Pooches all over the place, but once you have pieces and cards on the board, it's not so big a deal. They're just sort of a bad compromise, like worse than paper or a hard board. So I don't know why. Player aids, fairly reasonable. Have most of what you need on it, along with the stuff on the board, etc. If you can find it all. There was errata for the player aids and for the boards, which is kind of annoying. The player aids I marked up. The board errata is probably not important enough to do so. The books are kind of glossy, which if you know me, you don't like. The rules, well, this little 20-page rule book, full of color. That distracts me. It makes it harder for me to absorb rules. They seem to read pretty well. I didn't have a hell of a lot of trouble finding items in it, but they did manage 2 pages of errata on it, and some of that errata appears to be stuff that might be fairly important. At least the one piece about the movement rates of infantry is pretty big. The playbook also nice full color. I like the full color in the playbook, by the way. I don't like it in the rule book because it's just distracting. But the playbook, I'm only going to read through a playthrough, largely for entertainment rather than to try to learn anything from the game. Although it did help me, which is a dig against the rule book. There were a couple of concepts that didn't come through to me until I read the playbook. So, for better or worse, I thought I understood the rules, and then I read the playbook, and I said, "Wait, that doesn't work the way I thought it did." Anyway, I still didn't solve my problem. I still managed to screw up at least one rule. Yeah, probably more than one. So, one of the issues is it's a 3-player game, and that's a wonderful thing because there are very few. There are very few decent 3-player wargame-ish things. And I think this certainly fits in that mold very nicely. When I think what we used to try to hit that had good historical background, the only thing I can really think of was Hitler's War that was really specifically good. Warlords China in Disarray also works. Although the 3-player scenario is kind of weird. It's not bad. It just doesn't mesh well with the other scenarios. All of them have their kind of issues. And then Tannenberg. But there really aren't a lot of good 3-player wargame-ish things. And this one, is kind of in that. It's in that 4 to 6 hour range. Well, that's a kind of nice space to be in. So, there's a lot of good 4-player things for that kind of group that are kind of in the medium length, and you can get together and play it in a session. It's nice to have 1 and 3. But the dynamics of 3-player games are always weird. for one thing, if two people gang up on another, the other one's toast, right? Well, that may not be the case here, because think about it. In the war, two people ended up ganging up on the other. But early on in the war, it looked like a different two were kind of ganging up in a different sort of way. And this actually captures some of that dynamism in it fairly well, because you've got reasons to want to stay out of the war and try to force let's you and him fight, right? But it's also quite possible that you will get dragged in under circumstances that don't fit normal games. And that has to do with the victory points. So, one reason that you might get drawn in, that you might get that normal balance of power between three players might change, is that if you've weakened your front as one of the two people at war, and somebody else has a strike on you that they can automatically win the game by taking, the two capitals, or just one in the case of Russia or Germany, right? Then it may well be worth it for them to just jump in and do a coup de grace and finish you off, and boom, hey, I won. So that's one thing you got to worry about and protect against, and keep a garrison, on that border or whatever. Another thing is, even as one of the two powers at war, you might start a two-front war for two reasons. One is, as the Germans, historically, if you took Paris, you might very well now be able to make the move. You might not be able to make Sea Lion happen, but you might be able to make a Barbarossa move win you the game. But also, you got to worry about Russia winning the game, or the third player who's sitting out not fighting, just being able to sit there, collect peace dividends, build up their industry, maybe do diplomacy and stuff, and form a little nice reserve of populations and resources, and just sit back and win the game by doing nothing, basically, just building up their industry. In which case, somebody who's actually even fighting a tough war might turn and fight. Of course, there's also the option, the game that we were that I played, there was definitely some consideration between the Russians and the Germans, who were at war with one another, of, the Western Allies are kind of just padding their points here. What if we both attack them? What would happen under those circumstances? Of course, that ends up in an ugly three-sided war where all three powers are at war with the other two, which is funky as hell, but kind of cool, So the nature of the victory conditions keeps it from being kind of this standard three-player dynamic where it's just like, okay, well, let's gang up on him, split him up, and then we'll fight it out afterwards or whatever. That happens in a number of games. That doesn't happen in Hitler's war. Okay. So, I think there's a lot of fun in this game. A lot of fun. Especially in the early part. You don't have to deal with blocks, right? But is there any historical accuracy to it? Is there any basis to it? So, one of the big digs, say, against Axis and Allies is, man, there's just crazy shit going on that's got nothing to do with the war, and it's starting at a fixed point in the war, and things go off the rails right away. The best play, or any reasonable play, pretty much involves both sides in the Pacific, for example, losing their navies. Okay, whatever. This usually doesn't feel quite that unbelievable. This allows a lot of potential, very random alignments between the miners. There's room for serious diplomatic alignments between the major powers that might not seem valid. Um, there are some things that are just really goofy, like if I build navies, nobody knows about it. They just know I built something. It could be planes, could be boats, could be ground units, could be a fortification. There's no information on that when really, the European powers were pretty damn certain about force deployments at the strategic level. But it's necessary for the game, and that's one of the problems here, because part of this game has to do with hiding what you've got on a front. And of course, that may not be possible if they're tracking you carefully enough, right? Because they hear, okay, you built, three cadres and 4 combat value. Okay, well, I have an idea of how big your army is at this point. I don't know what it consists of. I don't know if it's all fortifications and I'm going to run into it and it's going to be ugly, or if for some strange reason you built nothing but Air Force or nothing but Navy. But even so, I can have some idea of what your total force strength is, but I have no idea really what stuff you got, and except from what I see you play. And that hidden factor is important in keeping someone off balance in terms of whether or not, they can afford to go to war with you. It does feel awfully weird, though. On the other hand, I don't think I've seen another game that handles the pre-war era that allows you to kind of make the decisions in a viable sort of way. The Nazi-Soviet Pact. There's no special rules for any of it. There's a partition rule, but it's a nice general rule that applies to any multi-space minor. That kind of emerges from the system rather than sort of being enforced on you by some special rule. It's a special rule in Gathering Storm. It's a special rule in the Days of Decision World and Flames combination. Sort of. Less so in Days of Decision World Flames it is. But we're looking at the pre-war stuff. But making that kind of decision that, if I can get something out of letting you have Warsaw, and then we're at peace for a long enough time, I think the Western Allies will tie you down. Yeah, I can do that, It really kind of hits to the motivation of these things. The motivation behind gathering the resources and population so you can build up your industry. I think it does a really good job on that side of things, and I think that's where it's kind of, even when I wasn't thinking too much about it, that's what was hitting and saying, yes, right, this is really awesome, and it really is. It really is. I was falling in love with the game for the first half of it, and then, you need that second half for that first half to work. It kind of didn't hold up quite as well during that period for me, especially the surprise at the end. But this is a really, really strong entry, and I'm not quite, I've looked at Churchill, but I haven't played it solo, so I can't really compare this to that. They're different games, though, very, very different styles of games, very different kind of thing that you're going for here. I really like the way this kind of projects that the dynamism in 3 players is just so different in this from any other game that I think I've seen, that I really enjoy how it's playing out, and I don't think Churchill has that. Well, I mean, there are other games from 2015 that I guess I'm kind of starting to look at this point. So we'll see. We'll see if this is just a great year for games, which in some ways it kind of may seem like it is. It's kind of a shame that I kind of didn't do a lot of pre-orders and waited, but it's not like I'm the cutting edge for people to learn about new games or anything anyway. Yeah. So then I'm going to be coming back with sort of discussion of the grand strategic World War II stuff, because I've covered almost all of it and remember a good deal of what I've covered. Yeah. Axis Empires is fading from view, even though I really liked it, so I'm going to have to go back and look at that. Alright, let's send this up.